Hello, today I'll be talking about 10 Divisive albums that I like or enjoy. Now, when it comes to these albums, it could be divisive within critics or divisive within the fan base. So, this is no particular order or anything. It's all rock and metal, but let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to start off with Gore by Deftones. Now, I see this album being more divisive with the fans more than the critics, especially nowadays. I mean, you have your Gore defenders like me, but you also have your people that really are not a big fan of this album. Many people put to this album as their worst, or at least one of their worst. But while I do agree that it is one of their weaker albums, I still think this album is pretty solid. Really, my only issue is really more towards the middle of the album, because I think it starts off strong and then I think it ends strong. But towards the middle, things get a bit uninteresting. You get some of their weakest material, in my opinion. But overall, I still think the album is pretty solid. Some of my favorites on here: Prayers Triangles. I like Acid Hologram and Doomed User. Doomed User being the heavy song on here. Phantom Bride, which has Dear Control from Alice in Chains. I really like that song. Definitely one of the highlights on the album. And I think Rubicon, the album closer, I think is pretty underrated. I mean, I wouldn't rank it as one of the best songs or anything like that. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that it is one of the highlights off the album. But Hearts/Wires I also think is pretty good. But you get to songs like Patura Infamante, however you pronounce that, and El Merle. Those are easily some of my least favorites on the album. But yeah, still, Gore overall I think is pretty solid, even if it's not one of their best. Then we move on to Dream Theater with Falling Into Infinity. So yeah, very different album. Definitely more accessible sounding than many of their other albums. Yeah, a bit more, I don't know, alternative sounding, you could say. Definitely more 90s definitely 90s sounding for sure. Definitely, you can tell it's of its time a little bit, but still, I think there's some pretty solid stuff on here, like New Millennium. Peruvian Sky is a bit of a more melodic song that I do dig. You do have the single on here, Hollow Years, which I do like. Bring My Soul, one of the heavier songs on here, and I think that's one of my favorites on the album. But then you have Lines in the Sand, which I think is maybe one of Dream Theater's most underrated songs. It's one of the epics on the album, the other one being Trial of Tears, which is also pretty good, but Lines in the Sand might be my favorite song on the album. And I think you get guest vocals in Lines in the Sand from the singer of King's X, or Doug Pinnick, if I got the name right. King's X, if you haven't heard of them, definitely check them out. But yeah, Lines in the Sand, definitely a great song, and if you haven't heard that song in a while, definitely check it out if you're a Dream Theater fan. But yeah, Falling Into Infinity, while different and while still not one of the best, I still think this album is pretty solid for what it is. But now we're going to go ahead and move on to The X Factor by Iron Maiden. Now, the Blaze Bayley era is not going to be for everybody. It is fairly different from the rest of their discography, especially this album. This album's a bit slower, a bit darker, a bit more moody. Especially when you look into what Steve Harris was going through around this time, you can definitely hear/understand why the album sounds the way it is, especially with how dark it is. But there's some pretty good stuff on here. I like Sign of the Cross, that's the epic on the album. Lord of the Flies and Man on the Edge. I think the singles on this album are pretty solid, are pretty good. But you get some pretty good deep cuts, like Judgment of Heaven. I really like that song. 2 a.m., while a bit of a more slower, a bit more moody song, I do really like that one also. The Aftermath is another pretty solid song on here. But yeah, overall, I enjoy this album from Iron Maiden. I wouldn't rank it as one of their best, but I do think it is overall pretty good, even if it's different. But let's go ahead and move on to Korn with Take a Look in the Mirror. So I have the version that just has the scrapbook artwork on it. But yeah, with this album they decided to go a bit more heavier, but for some reason this album seems to be kind of divided when it comes, not with just the fan base, but also with critics too. And find that kind of interesting, but I don't know. I personally dig the album. And I do like it more than some of the stuff they do later. Some of it, but some of my favorites on here, I like Right Now. That's definitely a banger of a song. Of course, you have the big song on here, Did My Time, maybe the biggest song on here. Everything I've Known, another highlight on the album. I also really like Play Me featuring Nas. Nas is definitely a great rapper. And yeah, definitely a great song. Alive is also pretty good. Of course, you also have Y'all Want a Single. Maybe a tad corny of a song, but I still like it though. But I think I do get plenty of enjoyability from this album personally. But yeah, overall, pretty good album from Korn, I'd say. But next, we're going to go ahead and move on to Lacuna Coil with Shallow Life. So probably their most accessible / most radio-friendly sounding album by far. And that's part of why people are fairly divided with the album, especially the fan base. Of course, it was produced by Don Gilmore, who has worked with Linkin Park and Both My Valentine. So yeah, for most people, this album is a step down from the previous albums, especially from Karma Code. And while I do agree it's a step down, I think honestly, I think this album is maybe one of their best. And that might not be a popular opinion. It might be unpopular. Who knows? But now, again, I wouldn't say it's as good as Karma Code or even Comalies, but I would say this would be probably in the top 5, I'd say. But overall, I do like many of the songs on here. I think the album starts off strong with the song Survive, and I Won't Tell You is another pretty good song on here. Out of the singles, I think Spellbound is easily the best of the singles. I Like It is okay. You also have the ballad, Wide Awake. That's another highlight on the album, and also a highlight for many people off the album. But I also think the song The Maze, which is a song that I re-listened to recently, I think that song is pretty underrated from Lacuna Coil. But yeah, really good song, I'd say. But yeah, this album, pretty good. If you weren't into it the first time, or if last time you heard it you weren't into it, definitely give it another chance, definitely give it another listen. Especially if you're, of course, a Lacuna Coil fan, or if you're not into Lacuna Coil, this album probably won't change your mind. But if you're not familiar with Lacuna Coil, I'd probably start off with Comalies or Karma Code, and then maybe check out this album. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to Linkin Park with Minutes to Midnight, their first Divisive album, probably. But I mean, when I was getting into Linkin Park, I didn't have a problem with this album. At least I don't think I did at the time. But either way, I still think this. I did listen to this album a lot when I was younger. I do remember that, especially certain songs like "Given Up" and "What I've Done," "Hands Held High." But this album, definitely a bit of a departure musically from the previous 2 albums. It's not as nu metal sounding. It's a bit more, I don't know, alternative rock, you could say, arguably. But some of my favorites on here, Given Up. Of course, you have that iconic long scream from Chester in that song. Bleed It Out's another highlight for me on the album. Shout of the Day. That song has its fans, but for me, I'm kind of in towards the middle. I think it's fine, but it's never been one of my personal favorites. Of course, I do like What I've Done. Hands Held High is a bit of a more melodic song, but I do like that one. Normal Sorrow is honestly, I think, is one of their best songs, and maybe my favorite song on the album, maybe, or at least it's a contender. But also, I think In Pieces is kind of underrated. I do like that song, but I think this album is actually one of Linkin Park's best. But if I had to choose a favorite Linkin Park album, it'd easily be Meteora. Most people point to Hybrid Theory, but for me, I go with Meteora. I just absolutely love that album. One of my favorite albums of all time. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to definitely a controversial album when it comes to the world of metal, and that is Load by Metallica. Now, I can't even imagine what fans were going through when this album dropped back in 1996, especially with how different it is, especially from their previous albums. I mean, this album's a bit more bluesy, you could say, a bit more hard rock, and Yeah, I can see why that would turn off many fans, especially at that time. I mean, of course, it's not as thrashy, or it's not as groovy or whatever like the Black Album, but I do like this album though. There are a few skippable songs on here, I will admit, but I think the first half especially is pretty good. Ain't My Bitch, one of my favorites. 2x4 probably being one of my favorites from this Load Reload era. I do enjoy it Until It Sleeps. King Nothing is probably my favorite of the singles. I've honestly never been a big fan of Hero of the Day. That song does have its fans. I know some people like it, but for me, that song has just never really done much for me, to be honest. Bleeding Me, one of the fan favorites off the album, and definitely one of my favorites too. Wasting My Height and Cure are also other songs that I do enjoy off the album. But yeah, overall, solid album from Metallica, but definitely not one of their best. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to some new metal with POD, their self-titled album, Payable on Death. Now, this album does have its defenders, but you also have some people that are really not into it. Because this album is fairly different from the rest of their discography. And, I mean, this album is a bit darker. You do, of course, have a different guitar player on here, Jason Truby, if I got the name right. But overall, kind of an interesting album. I mean, a common complaint that I've heard about this album is that it's, I guess, formulaic. But even if that's the case, I still think this album has a lot of songs that I think are pretty good, pretty solid. Probably has some of my favorite POD songs. Change the World maybe being my favorite of the singles. Will You is also pretty good, but Change the World, that's probably one of my most played songs off the album at this point. But Freedom Fighter is probably one of my favorite POD songs, and definitely one of the most underrated songs, I'd say. I and Identify is another highlight for me off the album. Execute the Sounds. You also have a pretty interesting instrumental towards the end of the album with the song Eternal. But yeah, overall, I enjoy this album. It's one of my personal favorite albums from POD. Not their best, but one of their best, I'd say, at least in my opinion. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to some progressive rock with Rush, with their album Hold Your Fire. Now, this is probably easily their poppiest album. Of course, you could tell that's of its time. It came out in 1987, and the keyboards are definitely very present in the album. And yeah, this album definitely has its following, definitely has its share of fans, but you also have some Rush fans that really hate it, especially if you're like a 70s Rush fan. I can't imagine you having much of a fun time with this album. But I like the album. Not one of their best, but still pretty solid. I like Force 10, Time Stand Still. Open Secrets, pretty underrated song. Lock and Key, another single off the album that I do like. Prime Mover, maybe one of the most underrated songs from their 80s work, I'd say. You do move towards the second half where things are not as strong. I do like Mission, but I'll admit the last three songs, Turn the Page, Taishan, and High Water, those are songs that I don't go back to all that much, to be honest. Especially Taishan. That song's kind of meh for me. Some people say it's bad or corny or whatever, but I feel like a lot of people don't like that song just because the band doesn't like the song, or at least a good chunk of the fans are like that. But Taishan, I don't hate it, but it's maybe probably the worst song on here. But either way, I do enjoy Hold Your Fire though. Now for the final album here, Silence in the Snow by Trivium. Maybe not divisive with the critics, at least from what I've seen, but definitely more divisive within the fan base because, of course, you have no screaming on here. The album's not as heavy as some of their other albums, like Shogun or In Waves, but honestly, even from first listen, I really enjoyed the album. I really like Matt Heafy's vocals in this album especially. I think his clean vocals are really strong, and this album is no exception. I mean, it's honestly still kind of hard for me to pick favorites off the album, but some of my favorites, of course, the title track, Leading the Blind, maybe being a contender for being maybe my favorite of the singles. I also really like Dead and Gone. The Thing That's Killing Me and The Ghost That's Haunting You, I think, are some of Trivium's most underrated songs, to be honest. Breathe in the Flames, probably one of the heaviest songs on here. I think that song is pretty good, but honestly, you really can't go wrong with any of the songs on here, especially if you're already a fan of the album. Of course, there are songs that are stronger than others, which you could say with any album, but yeah, overall, pretty good album from Trivium. But it is one of their weaker albums, but still pretty good, I'd say. I still enjoy many of the songs off the album. Now, as you notice, this album is signed, but I did get this copy from a record store, so no, this was not signed in person. I found this at a record store for like, I don't know, 11, 12, 13 bucks, something like that. So definitely got a pretty good deal for a signed CD, but yeah. Those are 10 Divisive albums that I do like. Let me know your thoughts on these albums. Do you love them? Do you hate them? Let me know some of your favorite, least favorite tracks from these albums, and all the good stuff. But anyways, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment and a like, subscribe. Have a nice day, and take care.